Before we begin tonight's file, I need you to know something. This is a new channel. We're just starting this journey into the darkest corners of human history, and we're trying to reach our first 100 subscribers. If you find value in what we do here, if these stories matter to you, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. We'd love to see 50 likes on this video. 50 people who believe these stories need to be told. And please leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We want to know how far these files travel, how many minds they reach in the darkness. Now, let's open tonight's case. There are some men who wear their monstrosity on their sleeve, and then there are those who hide it behind a smile. This is a true story. Every word you're about to hear happened. And because of the graphic nature of what occurred, I'll be omitting certain explicit details to comply with content guidelines. But make no mistake, what I can tell you is more than enough to understand the depths of what unfolded in Milwaukee between 1978 and 1991. She never called the police about a son. She called about a neighbor. A man in apartment 213. A man who smiled politely in the hallways, who kept to himself, who seemed unremarkable in every way. Glenda Cleveland didn't know she was living next to one of the most prolific predators in American history. She just knew something was wrong. The smells, the sounds, the feeling that crept up her spine every time she passed his door. But when she called the authorities, they told her it was none of her business. They told her to stop calling. They told her she was wasting their time. And for 13 years, a man named Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer continued his work, undisturbed, in the heart of a city that had stopped listening to the people who mattered least. Tonight we examine not just the crimes of one man, but the failure of every system designed to stop him. This is the file on Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. And if you think you know this story, I promise you, the details that haunt me most aren't the ones you've heard. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. On paper, he came from a middle-class American family. His father was a chemist, his mother a homemaker. They lived in suburban Ohio after Jeffrey's early childhood. There was a younger brother, David, born 6 years after Jeffrey. From the outside, it looked normal, comfortable, safe. But inside that house, something was quietly breaking apart. Lionel Dahmer was a man married to his work, emotionally distant in the way many fathers of that generation were taught to be. He provided. He was present physically, but emotionally he was a stranger to his son. Joyce Dahmer struggled with something darker, severe depression, crippling anxiety. She took medications, lots of them, during her pregnancy with Jeffrey. Some accounts suggest she was heavily medicated with barbiturates and morphine while carrying him, though this remains disputed. What isn't disputed is that after his birth, Joyce struggled to bond with her infant son. She feared germs obsessively. Some reports indicate she avoided holding Jeffrey, stopped breastfeeding him early, and showed signs of severe postpartum distress that was never properly treated. The marriage was volatile. Arguments echoed through the house. Joyce and Lionel would later divorce, but not before Jeffrey spent his formative years in an environment charged with tension, neglect, and emotional absence. At age 4, Jeffrey underwent hernia surgery. Around the same time, his younger brother David was born, and David required heart surgery that Jeffrey reportedly witnessed. Some psychologists have theorized that seeing his brother opened up on an operating table may have planted something in Jeffrey's young mind, a morbid fascination with what lies beneath the skin, with the architecture of the human body exposed and vulnerable. Whether this is true or merely speculative, we'll never know for certain, but we do know that by the time Jeffrey reached adolescence, he was already exhibiting behaviors that should have alarmed everyone around him. He began collecting roadkill, dead animals from the side of the road, squirrels, dogs, cats, which he would bring home. Most children would be repulsed. Jeffrey was fascinated. His father, Lionel, a chemist who worked with bones and specimens in his professional life, saw this as scientific curiosity. He taught Jeffrey how to bleach bones, how to preserve them, how to dissolve tissue with chemicals. Lionel later admitted he thought he was fostering his son's interest in science. He didn't realize he was teaching him the techniques he would later use on human beings. By age 13, Jeffrey was drinking heavily. By 14, he confessed years later, He was already fantasizing about acts I cannot describe here in detail, fantasies involving the deceased, involving control, involving the permanent possession of another human being. He was profoundly isolated. He had no close friends. He didn't date. He was described by classmates as a loner, strange, the kid who made uncomfortable jokes and drank alcohol in class, hidden in a coffee cup. Teachers noticed. Classmates noticed. But in the 1970s, in suburban Ohio, a quiet kid who kept to himself wasn't considered a crisis. He was just weird. And weird kids were left alone. In 1978, Jeffrey graduated from high school. His parents' marriage finally collapsed that same year. Joyce took David and left. Lionel had already moved out. And Jeffrey, 18 years old, was left alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, with his thoughts, his compulsions, and his escalating need for something he couldn't name but desperately wanted. That June, he would act on it for the first time. If this story is already getting under your skin, if you can feel where this is heading and you want to see it through to the end, subscribe. Because the files we open here don't offer easy answers, but they demand to be witnessed. We're building something here, and your support means we can keep bringing these stories to light. Steven Mark Hicks was 18 years old when he died. He had just graduated from high school. He was hitchhiking home from a rock concert on June 18, 1978, when Jeffrey Dahmer, driving alone, picked him up. Dahmer invited Hicks back to his house to drink beer and listen to music. Hicks agreed. They drank. They talked. And then, when Hicks said he needed to leave, something in Jeffrey snapped. He didn't want Hicks to go. He couldn't bear the thought of being alone again. So he picked up a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Hicks in the head. Then he strangled him. Dahmer would later describe this act as unplanned, as something that simply happened in a moment of desperation. But what came after was not impulsive. He dismembered Steven Hicks's body. He used the chemical knowledge his father had taught him. He dissolved the flesh, he pulverized the bones, he scattered the fragments in the woods behind the house, and then he went on living. He cleaned the house before his father returned. He enrolled in Ohio State University that fall. He dropped out after one semester. He drank constantly. He was aimless, directionless, haunted by what he'd done, but not deterred by it. In December 1978, his father made him enlist in the U.S. Army. Dahmer served from January 1979 to March 1981, stationed primarily in Baumholder, West Germany, as a combat medic. His drinking was so severe that he was discharged early. His superiors described him as an unreliable soldier, often intoxicated, unable to perform his duties. What's more chilling is what wasn't known at the time. During Dahmer's 2 years in Germany, there were 5 unsolved cases involving mutilated victims in the region. German authorities later investigated whether Dahmer was responsible, but no definitive evidence ever linked him to those deaths. To this day, the question remains open. Was Steven Hicks his only victim during those years, or were there others across the Atlantic that we simply cannot confirm? After his discharge, Dahmer moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in the suburb of West Allis. For the next several years, he worked low-wage jobs, a mixer at a chocolate factory, a phlebotomist at a blood plasma center. He drank. He visited bathhouses. He struggled with his identity, his desires, his compulsions. His grandmother was kind to him, patient with him, even as she began noticing strange smells coming from the basement and garage, even as she found bones that Jeffrey claimed were from animals. And for 9 years after Steven Hicks, Dahmer didn't take another life. Or if he did, we don't know about it. 9 years is an unusual gap for a predator. Most escalate quickly. But Dahmer later claimed that the guilt and fear from what he'd done to Hicks kept him from acting again for nearly a decade. Some psychologists believe him. Others think there may have been victims in that gap that were never discovered, never reported, never connected. We'll likely never know. But in 1987, the restraint, whatever was holding him back, broke completely. If you're still with me, if you haven't turned away yet, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know how far these stories travel. How many people across the globe are willing to sit in the dark with us and bear witness to what humanity is capable of? Steven Tuomi was 25 years old when he met Jeffrey Dahmer at a bar in Milwaukee in November 1987. They drank together. They went to a hotel room together. Dahmer later claimed he didn't remember what happened that night. He said he woke up to find Tuomi deceased beside him, with signs of trauma. Whether this was true or a convenient lie, we don't know. But what is certain is that Dahmer purchased a large suitcase, placed Tuomi's body inside, and took it back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it in the basement. This time, he didn't stop. This time, the 9-year gap was over, and the restraint was gone. Over the next 4 years, the pace accelerated. James Doxtator, 14 years old, January 1988. Richard Guerrero, 25, March 1988. Anthony Sears, 24, March 1989. With Sears, Dahmer kept the skull, painting it and keeping it as a grotesque trophy. His grandmother, disturbed by the smells and the strange hours Jeffrey kept, asked him to move out. In May 1990, he moved into his own apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. A one-bedroom unit, shabby, dim, unremarkable from the outside. But inside it would become a chamber of horrors. Between 1990 and 1991, Dahmer's actions escalated to a frenetic pace. Raymond Smith, 32, May 1990. Edward Smith, 27, June 1990. Ernest Miller, 22, September 1990. David Thomas, 22, September 1990. Curtis Straughter, 18, February 1991. Errol Lindsay, 19, April 1991. What I cannot detail here are the specific acts Dahmer committed, the rituals he developed, the escalating extremity of what he did to these men. But I can tell you this: he drugged them, he strangled them. And then he engaged in acts designed to keep them with him, to possess them permanently, to prevent them from ever leaving. He photographed every stage. He kept the photographs in a drawer, organized and catalogued. He preserved parts of their bodies, he kept skulls. He painted them gray to make them look artificial, like props, so visitors wouldn't question them. The men he targeted were not random. They were carefully selected. Most were young men of color. Many were gay or bisexual. Many were experiencing homelessness or economic instability. They were from the margins of society, from the communities that law enforcement routinely ignored. Dahmer knew this. He knew these men could disappear, and the world wouldn't immediately notice. He knew their families might report them missing, but those reports would go into a system that didn't prioritize them. And he was right. But then came the moment that should have ended everything, the moment that exposes the deepest, most unforgivable failure in this entire case. On the evening of May 27, 1991, 3 women, Nicole Childress, Sandra Smith and Glenda Cleveland's daughter, were walking near the Oxford Apartments when they saw something that stopped them cold. A young boy, naked, bleeding, stumbling through the street. He was clearly in distress, disoriented, unable to speak coherently. The women immediately recognized he was in danger. They called the police. They stayed with the boy, trying to cover him, trying to comfort him. And then Jeffrey Dahmer appeared. Dahmer approached calmly. He was polite. He explained to the women and the arriving police officers that this was simply a domestic dispute. The boy was his 19-year-old partner. They'd had an argument. He'd had too much to drink. Everything was fine. The boy's name was Conorak Synthesomphone. He was 14 years old. He was Laotian. He spoke limited English. He had been drugged so heavily that he couldn't communicate clearly, couldn't defend himself, couldn't tell the officers what had been done to him. The 3 women protested. They told the officers, John Balsazak and Richard Gabrish, that this was clearly a child, that something was horribly wrong, that they needed to help him. One of the officers told them to shut the hell up and threatened them with arrest if they didn't leave. Dahmer, meanwhile, showed the officers photographs that he claimed proved the boy was an adult, was his partner. The officers didn't question the photos closely. They didn't run Dahmer's name through their system. If they had, they would have discovered he was currently on probation for sexually assaulting Conorak's older brother 3 years earlier. That's right. Conorak Synthesomphone's 13-year-old brother had been victimized by Dahmer in 1988. Dahmer had been convicted, sentenced to probation, and was required to register. The information was in the system. The officers never checked. Instead, they escorted Konarak's synthesomphone back into apartment 213. They delivered a drugged, traumatized child directly into the hands of the man who had harmed him. They left, and within minutes, Konarak was deceased. Dahmer would take 4 more lives over the next 2 months before he was finally stopped. Let me be clear about what this was. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't an innocent mistake. This was active complicity. This was a system that looked at a bleeding, naked child being claimed by an adult white man and chose to believe the white man over 3 women of color and their own eyes. This was homophobia. The officers later radioed back to dispatch, joking about having to deal with a boyfriend-boyfriend thing and making derogatory comments. This was racism. Konarak was Laotian. The women who tried to save him were black, and their credibility was worth nothing in the eyes of those officers. If this makes you angry, if this makes you want to scream at the injustice, then share this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand why these stories matter, why we can't look away, why the failures of 1991 still echo today. Glenda Cleveland, who lived in the building next to Dahmer's apartment complex, had been calling police about apartment 213 for months. Strange smells, disturbing sounds. She had a feeling, the kind of feeling that sits heavy in your gut and won't leave. She called the police. She called the FBI. She was dismissed every single time. After the incident with Konarak, she called again the next day, asking what had happened to the boy. The officer on the phone told her, "It's all taken care of. It's as positive as I can be. I can't do anything about somebody's sexual preference in life." Glenda had explicitly told them the boy was a child. 6 times she used the word child. They didn't care. Glenda Cleveland was a black woman living in a predominantly black, economically disadvantaged neighborhood. In the eyes of the Milwaukee Police Department, her concerns were low priority. The department had a documented history of racial discrimination, policing interracial relationships, enforcing racial curfews, stationing 4 times as many officers in black neighborhoods as in adjacent white areas, conducting raids on LGBTQ+ establishments. When young black men started disappearing from Milwaukee streets, their cases weren't prioritized. Missing persons reports were filed and forgotten. Families were told their sons had probably just run away, probably just didn't want to be found. The assumption was always that these men, because of who they were, because of their race, because of their sexuality, because of their economic status, were disposable, and so Jeffrey Dahmer continued. Tony Hughes, 31, deaf and nonverbal, May 1991. Konarak synthesomphone, 14, May 1991. Matt Turner, 20, June 1991. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, July 1991. Oliver Lacey, 23, July 1991. Joseph Braidhoft, 25, July 1991. By the summer of 1991, Dahmer's apartment was a scene of unimaginable horror. Body parts in the refrigerator, skulls in the closet, a barrel of acid in the bedroom containing decomposing remains, photographs documenting everything. The smell was overwhelming, so strong that neighbors complained constantly, but Dahmer would explain it away. He said his freezer had broken, the meat had spoiled. Management believed him. On July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards, 32 years old, met Dahmer at a mall. Dahmer offered him money to come back to his apartment to pose for photographs. Edwards agreed, but when they arrived at apartment 213, something felt wrong. Dahmer handcuffed Edwards. He threatened him. He told him things Edwards would later struggle to articulate in court, things that made him realize he was about to become another victim. But Edwards fought. He kept Dahmer talking. He waited for an opportunity, and when Dahmer became momentarily distracted, Edwards punched him and ran. With one handcuff still dangling from his wrist, Edwards burst out of the apartment, ran down the stairs, and flagged down a police car. Officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller listened to Edwards's frantic story and decided to investigate. They accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213. Dahmer answered the door. He was calm, he was polite. He invited them inside. Officer Mueller asked for the key to the handcuffs. Dahmer said it was in the bedroom. Mueller went to the bedroom. He opened a drawer. Inside were Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies, photographs documenting every stage of what Dahmer had done to his victims. Muller shouted for his partner. They attempted to arrest Dahmer. He resisted briefly, then gave up. And then they began searching the apartment. What they found defies description. I will not detail it all here, I cannot, because of the explicit nature of what was discovered. But the officers who processed that scene, the detectives who catalogued the evidence, many of them required psychological counseling afterward. Some never fully recovered from what they witnessed. It was a museum of atrocity, a carefully maintained archive of suffering. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991. By July 25th, he had confessed to 17 acts committed over 13 years. He was cooperative. He was detailed. He walked investigators through every name, every date, every method. He showed no emotion. He answered every question. And when they asked him why, he gave them an answer that chilled everyone in the room. I just wanted to keep them with me. If you've made it this far, if you're still here in the darkness with me, I need to ask something of you. Hit that like button. Help this video reach more people. We're trying to get to 50 likes. 50 people who believe these stories need to be told, who believe the victims deserve to be remembered. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the next file might be even darker. The legal proceedings began in earnest in early 1992. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts. Ohio claimed jurisdiction over Steven Hicks separately. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, but on January 13, 1992, he changed his plea to guilty but insane. This shifted the trial's focus from whether he had committed the acts, he'd confessed, the evidence was overwhelming, to whether he understood what he was doing was wrong, whether he was capable of controlling his actions. Wisconsin law at the time required only 10 of 12 jurors to agree on an insanity verdict, a lower threshold than the unanimous standard for conviction. The defense assembled a team of psychiatrists who testified that Dahmer suffered from multiple severe mental illnesses, necrophilic paraphilia, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, psychotic features, and profound antisocial tendencies. Dr. Judith Becker testified that Dahmer's actions were driven by uncontrollable compulsions, that his mental illness rendered him unable to conform his behavior to the law. His attorney, Gerald Boyle, painted a picture of a profoundly damaged man, isolated and desperate, driven by forces he couldn't resist. Boyle argued that Dahmer was not evil. He was sick. The prosecution countered with their own expert witnesses. Dr. Park Dietz, a renowned forensic psychiatrist, testified that Dahmer's behavior demonstrated clear planning and premeditation. He purchased supplies in advance, sleeping pills to drug victims, hydrochloric acid to dissolve remains, suitcases and containers for transport. He arranged his furniture strategically. He cleaned meticulously. He targeted victims carefully, selecting individuals without strong family connections, people whose disappearances would cause less immediate alarm. This, the prosecution argued, showed awareness of wrongdoing and the ability to control his actions. District Attorney Michael McCann argued that Dahmer was not insane. He was evil, calculating and fully aware of what he was doing. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury heard testimony from psychiatrists, from surviving victims, from the families of the deceased. They saw the photographs, they heard the confessions, and on February 15, 1992, after deliberating for 5 hours, the jury returned its verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was legally sane. This verdict has remained controversial. Most of the mental health professionals who examined Dahmer agreed he was mentally ill. But legal insanity is a specific threshold. It requires that the defendant either didn't understand the nature of their actions or couldn't distinguish right from wrong. The jury concluded that despite his mental illness, Dahmer understood what he was doing was wrong, evidenced by his efforts to hide his actions, his lies to police, his careful selection of victims. One juror, Carl Stahl, later said they believed Dahmer was a con artist who planned his actions to satisfy his desires without regard for others. On February 17, 1992, Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms, one for each victim under Wisconsin's jurisdiction. Each sentence carried an additional 70 years. In May 1992, Ohio sentenced him to an additional life term for Steven Hicks. Combined, Dahmer faced over 900 years in prison with no possibility of parole. At his sentencing, Dahmer addressed the court. His words were chilling in their resignation. "I take all the blame for what I did. Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I never wanted freedom. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I have some peace." The families of the victims also addressed the court. Rita Isbell, sister of Errol Lindsay, lunged at Dahmer, screaming, restrained by deputies. Shirley Hughes, mother of Tony Hughes, wept as she described her son's smile, his kindness, his dreams. The courtroom was a crucible of grief and rage, and Dahmer sat quietly, expressionless, as though he were watching from a great distance. Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Initially, he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. Corrections officials knew what happened to predators who harmed children in general population. But after a year, Dahmer requested to be moved into general population. He claimed he wanted to be baptized, that he had found religion, that he wanted to atone. A prison minister, Roy Ratcliffe, spent time with him, and later wrote that Dahmer seemed sincere in his desire for redemption. But others who interacted with Dahmer in prison told a different story. Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate serving a life sentence for another case, worked alongside Dahmer on a prison cleaning detail. Scarver later reported that Dahmer was unsettling even in prison. He would shape his food into grotesque forms resembling body parts and place them around the prison to disturb other inmates. He would make jokes about his crimes. He would whisper, "I bite," to guards. Ratcliffe himself admitted that Dahmer toyed with his image to amplify it and instill more fear, suggesting that even his religious conversion may have been performative, another mask. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail in the prison gymnasium with two other inmates, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. The detail was supposed to be supervised, but the guard left them alone for approximately 20 minutes. What happened in those 20 minutes remains somewhat disputed, but the outcome is not. Scarver beat both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer's skull was crushed. He was transported to a hospital but was pronounced deceased 1 hour after arrival. Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. Scarver later stated he was fiercely disgusted by Dahmer's crimes, particularly those involving the young victim whose case we discussed earlier. Some have speculated that Scarver was encouraged or enabled by guards who wanted Dahmer eliminated. Others believe it was simply an act of prison justice, the inevitable consequence of putting a man like Dahmer in general population. Whatever the truth, Jeffrey Dahmer's life ended violently, just as the lives of his 17 confirmed victims had. But the story doesn't end with his passing. The questions raised by the Dahmer case continue to reverberate. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, if you've witnessed this story from beginning to end, then I have one final request. Share this video with someone. Someone who needs to hear it. Someone who needs to understand what happened in Milwaukee, what failed and why it matters, and leave a comment. Tell us what you're thinking. Tell us what haunts you most about this case. We read every single comment, and your engagement helps this channel grow. One of the most persistent questions is whether Dahmer's 17 confirmed victims represent his true count. During his time in West Germany with the army, 5 unsolved cases occurred in the region, cases involving mutilated victims that bore disturbing similarities to Dahmer's later crimes. German authorities investigated, but could never definitively link him to those deaths. Dahmer denied involvement, but he was also drinking heavily during that period, and his memory of events was often unreliable. Did he take lives in Germany that we'll never be able to confirm? We don't know. There's also the case of Adam Walsh, a 6-year-old boy who was abducted from a Florida shopping mall in 1981 and found deceased 2 weeks later. John Walsh, Adam's father, later speculated that Dahmer may have been responsible, as Dahmer was living in Florida briefly during that period. But Dahmer denied this as well, and the case was officially attributed to Otis Toole, a serial confessor whose reliability is questionable. The Walsh case remains officially solved, but emotionally unresolved. What we do know is that Dahmer's victim count reflects only what could be proven. He may have taken more lives that were never discovered, never reported, never investigated, because the victims came from communities that society had already decided didn't matter. The officers who returned the 14-year-old victim to Dahmer, John Balcerzak and Richard Gabrish, were fired from the Milwaukee Police Department following an internal investigation. But they faced no criminal charges. They appealed their termination and were actually reinstated with back pay in 1994. Balcerzak later became president of the Milwaukee Police Association. Let that sink in. The man who delivered a child to a predator faced no criminal consequences and went on to represent his fellow officers. The system protected him. The system always protects itself. Glenda Cleveland, the woman who tried desperately to save lives, who called police repeatedly, who refused to be silenced, received a call from President Bill Clinton after Dahmer's arrest, thanking her for her courage, but she received no financial compensation, no formal recognition from the city of Milwaukee. She continued living in the same neighborhood, carrying the weight of knowing she had been right, that she could have saved lives if anyone had listened. She passed away in 2011. Her obituary described her as a hero, but heroes shouldn't have to fight so hard to be heard. The families of the victims filed a class action lawsuit against the city of Milwaukee, alleging that police negligence and discrimination had enabled Dahmer to continue harming people. The city settled for $850 to be divided among the families, roughly $50,000 per family. $50,000. That's what the city decided those lives were worth. The question of why Dahmer did what he did has never been satisfactorily answered. Was he born this way? A genetic anomaly? A neurological aberration? His father, Lionel, admitted to having similar dark fantasies in his youth, though he claimed he never acted on them. Research into the MAOA gene, sometimes sensationally called the warrior gene, has suggested that certain genetic variations, combined with childhood trauma, may predispose individuals toward violent behavior. But this is not determinism. It's correlation, not causation. Many people carry those genetic markers and never harm anyone. Was Dahmer created by his environment? The emotional neglect, the unstable home, the lack of intervention when his disturbing behaviors began emerging in adolescence? There's a strong case to be made here. Children don't typically develop necrophilic fantasies at 14 without something having gone profoundly wrong. The dissection of animals, the social isolation, the heavy drinking, these were all red flags that no one addressed. His parents were too consumed by their own problems to see what was happening to their son. The school system noticed but did nothing. Society shrugged and looked away. Most likely the truth is a convergence of factors: genetic predisposition, neurological abnormality, childhood trauma, social isolation, untreated mental illness and substance abuse, all feeding into each other in a devastating feedback loop. Dahmer himself, in his final interview before his demise, said he believed he was born with a fundamental part missing, but he also acknowledged that his choices were his own, that he could have sought help and didn't. He said he just wanted to be normal, but couldn't find a way to be. The Dahmer case forced a national conversation about institutional racism and homophobia in law enforcement. After his arrest, activists and community leaders in Milwaukee demanded accountability. Reverend Jesse Jackson visited the city and spoke publicly about how police had chosen the word of a perpetrator over an innocent woman. The case became a rallying point for LGBTQ+ advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. But meaningful reform has been slow. Police departments across the country still struggle with implicit bias, with underinvestment in marginalized communities, with the tendency to dismiss concerns from people who don't fit a certain demographic profile. The Milwaukee Police Department implemented new training protocols on cultural sensitivity and missing persons investigations. But decades later, we are still seeing cases where victims from marginalized communities are overlooked, where families are dismissed, where systemic indifference enables harm. The Dahmer case didn't fix the problem, it just made it impossible to deny the problem existed. There's also the broader philosophical question about mental illness and criminal culpability. If Dahmer was genuinely mentally ill, and the psychiatric evidence suggests he was, Then what does it mean to hold him responsible? Can someone with profound psychopathology truly choose to conform their behavior to the law? The jury said yes, but many mental health professionals disagreed. This tension between legal responsibility and psychological reality remains unresolved in our criminal justice system. We want to believe that people who do monstrous things are simply monsters, that they chose evil freely and could have chosen otherwise. It's comforting, it's simple, but the reality is far more complicated and far more uncomfortable. Dahmer's brain was removed during his autopsy, and his mother Joyce requested it be preserved for scientific study, hoping it might provide answers. Lionel Dahmer, however, fought this, arguing that his son deserved to be laid to rest intact. The courts ultimately sided with Lionel, and the brain was destroyed. We'll never know what secrets it might have revealed. The Oxford apartments where the crimes occurred were demolished in 1992. The site remained empty for years. No one wanted to build there, no one wanted to live there. Eventually it became a patch of grass, unmarked, unremarkable. There's no memorial to the victims at that site, no plaque, no acknowledgement that 17 human beings lost their lives because every system that should have protected them failed. The city wanted to forget, but forgetting doesn't serve justice. Forgetting serves only those who would prefer not to be held accountable. The victims' names deserve to be spoken. Steven Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, James Doxtator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthesomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft, 17 human beings, 17 futures erased, 17 families shattered. They were sons, brothers, friends, lovers. They had dreams. They had people who loved them, and they were failed by their community, by law enforcement, by a society that had already decided they were expendable. So what do we take from this? What's the lesson of Jeffrey Dahmer? It's not that evil exists. We already knew that. It's not that some people are broken beyond repair. That's nothing new. The lesson is that monsters don't operate in a vacuum. They rely on our indifference. They thrive in the spaces where we've decided not to look, where we've decided certain lives don't matter as much as others. Dahmer was able to do what he did for 13 years because the systems designed to stop him were corroded by prejudice, by apathy, by institutional rot. Every time Glenda Cleveland called the police and was dismissed, Dahmer was emboldened. Every time a missing persons report was filed and forgotten, he grew more confident. Every time society looked at a young black man, a gay man, a homeless person, and decided their disappearance wasn't urgent, wasn't worth investigating thoroughly, wasn't worth the resources, Dahmer learned he could continue. The system didn't just fail to stop him. The system actively enabled him. And here's what haunts me most, what keeps me awake at night when I close these files. How many others are operating right now in those same spaces? How many predators are thriving in the margins, in the communities we've decided don't deserve our full attention, our full protection? The Dahmer case happened over 30 years ago, but the conditions that allowed it, the racism, the homophobia, the economic inequality, the institutional indifference, those haven't been eradicated. They've just become more subtle, more difficult to name. When we talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, we need to talk about more than just one man's pathology. We need to talk about the pathology of a society that creates tiers of human worth, that decides some deaths matter more than others, that builds systems of protection around those deemed valuable, and leaves everyone else to fend for themselves. Because the real horror of the Dahmer case isn't just what one disturbed individual did in apartment 213. The real horror is that he had help. Not accomplices in the traditional sense, but accomplices nonetheless. Every officer who dismissed a concerned citizen, every detective who didn't prioritize a missing persons case, every system that looked at suffering and decided it wasn't their problem. Dahmer himself, in one of his final interviews, said something that I think about often. He said, "I couldn't find any meaning for my life when I was out there. I'm sure as hell not going to find it in here. This is the grand finale of a life poorly spent." He was right about one thing: his life was poorly spent, but it wasn't just poorly spent by him. It was poorly spent by every adult who saw the warning signs in his childhood and did nothing. It was poorly spent by every institution that could have intervened and chose not to. It was poorly spent by a society that created the conditions in which a man like him could operate undetected for 13 years. There's a common narrative around cases like this, that these predators are master manipulators, criminal geniuses who outsmart everyone around them. But that's not what happened here. Dahmer wasn't brilliant. He wasn't even particularly careful. Neighbors complained about the smells constantly. Police had been to his apartment before on domestic disturbance calls. He had a criminal record. The warning signs were everywhere, flashing in neon, impossible to miss. He wasn't caught for 13 years because he was clever. He was free for 13 years because no one in power cared enough to look closely at what was happening to young men of color in Milwaukee's poorest neighborhoods. And this is where I want to challenge you, everyone watching this right now. When you hear about a missing person in your community, do you pay attention? When you hear about crimes in neighborhoods that aren't yours, neighborhoods that are predominantly inhabited by people who don't look like you, do you care as much? When someone tells you they're concerned about something, someone who doesn't have institutional credibility, someone from the margins, do you listen? Because Glenda Cleveland was trying to tell anyone who would listen. The 3 women who found that 14-year-old boy were screaming for help, and they were all silenced by people who had decided their concerns didn't matter. If you're still here, if you've made it to the end of this file with me, then I think you understand that these stories aren't just entertainment. They're not just true crime content to consume and forget. They're mirrors, they're warnings, they're invitations to examine the world we've built and ask ourselves what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to ignore, and whose suffering we've decided is acceptable collateral damage for maintaining the status quo. The families of Dahmer's victims didn't want his story told. Many of them objected to the media attention, to the books, to the films and documentaries that would inevitably follow. They wanted to grieve privately, to remember their loved ones, without having them forever defined as Dahmer victims. I respect that. I understand it. But I also believe there's a responsibility to bear witness, to remember not just the perpetrator, but the systems that enabled him, to keep asking the uncomfortable questions that might prevent the next tragedy. Jeffrey Dahmer is gone, but the structures that allowed him to flourish, they're still here. The prejudices that determined which victims mattered and which didn't, those haven't disappeared. They've evolved, adapted, found new forms, and unless we're willing to confront them directly, to dismantle them brick by brick, to build something better in their place, then this file isn't closed. It's just waiting for the next chapter to be written. Before I close this file for tonight, I want to read you something. It's from a letter written by Shirley Hughes, the mother of Tony Hughes, one of Dahmer's victims. Tony was 31 years old, deaf since early childhood, working toward his dreams despite the barriers society placed in his path. After Dahmer's conviction, Shirley wrote, "My son was not a throwaway person. He was not disposable. He was loved. He mattered. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure people know that." That's what this is really about. Not the sensational details of one man's crimes, but the radical act of insisting that every victim mattered, that every life had value, that every person who was failed by the system deserved to have their story told with dignity and truth. Steven Hicks mattered. Stephen Tuomi mattered. James Doxtator mattered. Richard Guerrero mattered. Anthony Sears mattered. Raymond Smith mattered. Edward Smith mattered. Ernest Miller mattered. David Thomas mattered. Curtis Straughter mattered. Errol Lindsay mattered. Tony Hughes mattered. Conorak Synthesomphone mattered. Matt Turner mattered. Jeremiah Weinberger mattered. Oliver Lacey mattered. Joseph Braidhoft mattered. Say their names, remember them. Not as statistics, not as case numbers, not as Dahmer's victims, but as people who deserved better than what this world gave them. The Milwaukee Cannibal case remains one of the most studied in criminal psychology, not because of its extreme nature, though it was extreme, but because of what it reveals about the intersection of individual pathology and systemic failure. Universities teach it in criminology courses. Law schools analyze the legal proceedings, Police academies use it as a case study in what not to do. But all of that academic analysis means nothing if we don't translate it into meaningful change, if we don't actually reform the systems that failed, if we don't actually address the prejudices that allowed those failures to persist. In 2022, Netflix released a dramatized series about Dahmer's crimes. It became one of the most watched shows on the platform. The families of the victims spoke out, saying they hadn't been consulted, that they were re-traumatized by seeing their loved ones' final moments depicted for entertainment. The debate that followed was intense. Do we have a right to tell these stories? Is there a way to examine these cases without exploiting the victims? Where's the line between education and sensationalism? I don't have perfect answers to those questions, but I know this. If we're going to tell these stories, we have an obligation to tell them completely. Not just the gruesome details that make people click, but the context that explains how it happened. The systemic failures, the ignored warnings, the institutional prejudices, the victim's full humanity, because anything less than that is just exploitation dressed up as awareness. The Midnight File exists because I believe some stories demand to be told, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they're painful, even when we'd rather forget them. But telling them comes with responsibility. It requires us to look beyond the surface, to ask why and how and what if, to resist the easy narratives and grapple with the complicated truth. Jeffrey Dahmer was a disturbed individual who committed unspeakable acts. That's true. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes every person who could have stopped him and didn't. Every system that failed the people it was supposed to protect. Every prejudice that determined whose life mattered and whose didn't. And the whole truth demands something from us, those of us who hear these stories, who bear witness to what happened. It demands that we do better, that we listen when marginalized communities raise concerns, that we demand accountability from institutions that fail, that we refuse to accept a world where some lives are treated as more valuable than others, that we build systems that actually protect everyone, not just those who already have power and privilege. I know this has been a long journey tonight, over an hour of sitting in the darkness with me, examining one of humanity's ugliest chapters. If you're feeling heavy right now, if you're carrying the weight of what you've heard, that's appropriate. This story should weigh on you. It should disturb you. It should make you angry and sad and determined to ensure nothing like this happens again. Those emotions aren't weaknesses. They're proof that you're still connected to your humanity, that you haven't become numb to suffering, that you refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. So here's what I'm asking from you as we close this file. Don't just watch and forget. Don't let this be passive entertainment that you consume and move on from. Take something from this story. Maybe it's a commitment to listen more carefully when someone raises concerns. Maybe it's a determination to challenge your own biases about whose voices deserve to be heard. Maybe it's a resolve to support organizations working to reform criminal justice, to protect vulnerable communities, to demand accountability from law enforcement. Whatever it is, let this story change something in you. Let it matter. And if you believe in what we're doing here at the Midnight File, if you think these stories need to be told with care and context and respect for the victims, then subscribe. Help us reach that first 100 subscribers. Hit the like button if this video moved you, challenged you, taught you something you didn't know before. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what you're taking away from this story, what questions you're still sitting with, where in the world you're watching from. Because every subscription, every like, every comment tells us that these files matter, that people are willing to sit in the uncomfortable truth rather than look away. The Midnight File isn't about glorifying violence or sensationalizing tragedy. It's about refusing to let these stories be forgotten, about honoring the victims by telling their stories completely and truthfully, about examining the failures that enabled horror so we can build something better. It's about opening files that others would rather keep closed and saying, this happened, this is why it happened, and we have a responsibility to learn from it. Milwaukee tried to forget Jeffrey Dahmer. They tore down his apartment building. They avoided his name. They wanted the whole nightmare to fade into history. But forgetting doesn't prevent recurrence. Remembering does. Learning does. Changing does. And that's what we're here to do, to remember, to learn, to change. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. Milwaukee buried its secret under demolished buildings and settled lawsuits and reformed training protocols. But the secret won't stay buried. It surfaces in every missing persons case that's not taken seriously enough. In every marginalized community that's told their concerns don't matter. In every system that protects its own rather than protecting those it's meant to serve. The secret is that we built a world where Jeffrey Dahmer was possible. And until we rebuild that world from the ground up, the secret remains alive, waiting for the next person who understands how to exploit the spaces where we've decided not to look. This is Julian Cross, closing the file on Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. 17 victims, 13 years, one devastating catalogue of systemic failure. The file is closed, but the questions it raises remain open. And they're questions we all need to answer, not just as individuals, but as a society. If stories like this stay with you, if they haunt you the way they haunt me, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the Midnight File, because there are more stories to tell, more files to open, more uncomfortable truths that demand to be spoken. And I'll be here, at midnight, waiting to open the next one with you. Until then, remember the names. Remember that every victim mattered. Remember that evil doesn't operate alone. It requires our silence, our indifference, our willingness to look away, and refuse to give it what it needs. This is the Midnight File. And some files never really close, they just wait in the darkness, reminding us of what we're capable of, both the worst and, if we choose it, the best. Good night, and remember, the world is watching how we treat those who have no one else to protect them. Make sure we're worth watching.